This is just proof that you can brush and roll your kitchen cabinets and get a professional spray-like finish. If you have kitchen cabinets that already have been painted and you're trying to repaint them, the good news is you don't have to strip them down to the bare wood. Here's an old cabinet door that I'm going to be using for an example. And if we look close here, you can see whoever painted this before used a brush and left a bunch of brush strokes. So I'm going to show you what you can do to avoid that. Now the first thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to clean this really good. I'm going to use a degreaser, which is spray 9, but you can also use Dawn dish soap, you can use crud cutter, you can use TSP, they all work great. But the goal is to get rid of all of this grease and the grime and all the dirt that you usually find in your kitchen. You want to get this off your surface before sanding it so that the primer that we're going to use or the paint that we're going to use actually adheres to the surface without peeling later on. Now keep in mind that when you're using chemicals, always wear gloves and protective gear. You can wear glasses if you choose to, but you always want to protect yourself. I'm just going to use a Brillo pad to clean the surface. Now in order to get into these creases right here, an old paintbrush or even a toothbrush works. Now you want to make sure that you get deep into these cracks right here. If not, that could cause your paint to peel later on, and we don't want that. Look at that gunk right there. You see that? That's what we're trying to get rid of. Now after I degrease everything, I'm just going to take a damp rag and wipe off all the excess suds or any film that might have been left from the cleaner. Again, you want to make sure that you get in these corners, into the creases, the crevices right here. You don't want to leave anything behind that could cause your adhesion to fail. Remember how I said that this door had brush marks on it and whoever painted before probably used a brush? What we're going to do is we're going to get rid of these brush strokes. In order to do so, we're going to have to do some light sanding. Now you don't want to sand without cleaning your surface first. What can happen is while you're sanding, you're going to end up pushing all that grease and that grime into the surface, into your old paint. That's going to cause your paint to peel later on, or you can end up having some stains if you do them white. So always clean your surface before you sand. Now I'm going to be using an orbital sander, but you can use sandpaper and do it by hand, but it's much faster with one of these. Now I do a lot of sanding, so I have an expensive sander. You don't have to have an expensive sander, and I'm going to leave a link to a budget-friendly one down below. Okay, let me show you something real quick. When you're sanding out brush strokes or any paint drips, if you look close here, you can see a color difference. This is where we sanded down the highs, right? The lighter spots is where we sanded out the highs, and the dark spots are still your lows. So the goal is to get to those lows. You want to have everything even so that all of this is a light color like this. All these dark spots right here, we're trying to get rid of. Now in order to get into this decorative bevel right here, I'm going to use this soft sponge, which is going to contour to the shape of it and make it much easier to sand. Okay, so now that everything's sanded, I'm going to use this old paintbrush to dust off the surface, and I'm going to use this tack rag right here. Now this is not just an average paper towel, this is a special rag that'll take off even the finest dust. Now what I like to do, I like to take this vacuum hose and vacuum the cracks right here, just so that I make sure that I get all the dust and all the debris. And then I'll follow up with my tack rag. And if we look close, this was all of the dust that was still on the surface. Okay, so now that we cleaned and sanded our surface, we're ready to paint. Now, if you were the person that painted your cabinets previously, you know what paint you used. So it's okay to paint over them without priming them, only if you know what paint was used previously and if you use the same paint. However, since I don't know what product was used here before, I'd rather be safe than sorry. So I'm going to go ahead and prime this using a high bond primer. Now I'll be using a urethane modified primer, and I'm going to apply it with this mini roller. This is a microfiber mini roller, which has a 3/8 inch nap. Now I already had one in my primer can, but these are the same. This is just fatter. Now the primer that I'm using is a urethane modified primer. It's very similar to an oil-based primer, but it's water-based, which makes it much easier to work with and much easier to clean up. You can clean this up with just soap and water. But like I said, it's similar to an oil-based primer because it sticks to almost any surface. I always start off with my brush and then I go ahead and use my roller to roll over the brush marks. This will eliminate all of the brush strokes and leave you with a nice smooth finish. Now the thing about primer is you don't have to do a heavy coat. This is just for adhesion, so a thin layer is good enough. So if you see some of the old paint bleeding through, don't worry about it, that's normal. Unlike the top coat, the primer doesn't have to go on thick. And as you can tell, I used a gray primer. The reason I'm doing a gray primer is because the top coat is going to be gray too. So you always want to tint your primer to the color that you're putting on. Now I see a lot of people skip this step, but if you're at the paint store already, might as well have them tint your primer to the same color that you're putting on, whether it's gray, blue, green, or whatever, just in case you end up chipping something in the future, it doesn't look as obvious. If you have a white primer underneath, and let's say your kids run through the house or your pets or somebody scratches up your surface, it won't stick out as much. Now obviously if you're painting your kitchen cabinets white, you don't have to tint your primer. You can just use the white primer, but any other color I would always suggest having it tinted. All right, now that the primer's dry, I'm just gonna give this a light scuff sand using my sanding sponge. And what that does, it's gonna knock off any debris or dust that could have landed in here while this was drying. And since we wanna get a nice smooth finish, I always suggest sanding in between your coats. Now you don't have to use a lot of pressure. We're just gonna lightly sand it. And I would say it's about the same pressure as if you were cleaning some windows. And after I scuff the surface, I always vacuum it again and use my tack rack to get it nice and clean. Now that the door is prepped and primed, it's ready to be painted. Now I'm not sponsored by Sherwin-Williams. I just really like this product. I use this for all of my DIY projects around the house. Now I've done cabinets that lasted well over 5 years without chipping and peeling. I do trim with this, I do cabinets with this. This is really good stuff. Now this is the product that I'm gonna be using. It's called Emerald by Sherwin-Williams, and I'm gonna be using a semi-gloss. This is a urethane trim enamel. It dries just as hard as a oil-based paint, but it's a water-based paint, so it's very easy to clean up and very easy to use. And as you can see, it's dry to the touch in 2 hours, and the recoat time on this is 4 hours. So at 77 degrees, you let it sit for about 4 hours and then you're ready to recoat. Now, if this was an oak cabinet and we'd have grain, I would use this microfiber roll just so that we can push the paint into the grain. But since this is smooth, I'm going to use a mohair roller. Now I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to start with this bevel right here. I'm going to make sure I get into all the cracks. And then I'm going to follow up with my mohair roller just to eliminate all the brush strokes. Now you don't want to put it on too heavy because you want to avoid the paint pooling up in these corners right here. Now to show you an example, I went real heavy right here and you can see the paint pooling in here. You want to avoid that, so I'm just going to take my brush and push this out again, and this is what your corner should look like. Just going to take the brush and remove the paint right here. The same thing goes for this inner corner right here. Just enough paint to cover it. Next, I'll take the roller and get rid of all the brush strokes. Now, when you're applying the paint, it doesn't matter what direction you're going. Your final stroke, however, should be all going into the same direction. So whether it's up and down, left or right, doesn't matter, as long as it's all in one direction. Now we're gonna let this dry for 4 hours, then we're gonna come back, lightly scuff sand it, and do our second coat. Now sometimes you'll put on one coat and it looks good, but you're not getting the thickness that you need to really protect your cabinets. So always do 2 coats. All right, so this is dry. Now I'm gonna go ahead and use a fine sanding sponge. I'm gonna pass over this a couple of times, but I'm gonna make sure that I hit every direction so that I get rid of any orange peel or any unevenness. And then I'm gonna come back with the mohair roller and we should have a nice smooth finish after that. Now I'm not using too much pressure, just something really light. I have a couple of high spots right here that I'm gonna knock down. But again, not a lot of pressure. I'm just trying to get this nice and smooth. And as you can tell, I'm going up and down, left and right. I'm making sure I'm hitting every spot in every direction. And don't forget to do your edges. All right, and this is what it looks like after the second coat is dry. Now keep in mind that although you can handle this after 4 hours, you're gonna have to let it sit for about 7 days to fully cure. So be easy with it, but after those initial 7 days, you're good to go. Now, if you wanted to, you could sand this down even more with an 800 grit sandpaper and do a third coat, but I think this is really good. I'm happy with this, and this is just proof that you can brush and roll your kitchen cabinets and get a professional spray-like finish.